a lot of beginners tend to do this. They don't do enough cutting of what's panned to the side. Usually when something's overcompressed, it builds up in the low end. So you've got to do some aggressive cutting of the low end. And maybe after it, compress it even more. The best mixes I've ever heard from the best mixers in the world are very often at 44.1. There is no perfect mix. There's no perfection in music. And don't try to do it because you're going the wrong way.
Can you describe us your mastering process step by step? In this episode, we dive into the world of mastering with Brian Lucey, the engineer behind the iconic sounds of Green Day, Arctic Monkeys, The Black Keys, Marilyn Manson, and Depeche Mode, between others. Brian walks us through his detailed mastering process, discusses how he tailors the low end for various genres, and shares the secrets behind his mastering chain, among many other things. Brian, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. It's great to meet you.
So let's start. What are the most common mixing mistakes you have to correct?
Well, I mean, I don't really use correction as a concept. I mean, I would say that, I don't really think of mastering as a fixing step, but maybe it's a language thing between us. But, I wouldn't necessarily say mistakes, but things that, there's a variety of trends that people might get themselves into that could be done better. So for example, overcompressing a verse so that when you get to the chorus, there's not a lift of energy. Even a half dB lift of energy into a chorus is important. Momentum in the track from beginning to end is one of, if not the most important qualities of a track. So in order to have momentum, you need to have some dynamic movement, no matter the style. And this could be very small. I mean, sometimes it's 2 or 3 tenths. That I'll bump sections up and down to kind of keep them moving in a way that's a little bit more orchestral. Even if it's pop music, there's something objectively positive about that. Human beings like motion. You can't go too far, obviously, with certain styles, but you can always put a little in. And sometimes that's necessary if people are setting compression in a verse and not adjusting threshold or adjusting master fader for a chorus. So that would be one. What else? I don't know. I mean, there's fairly consistent things all the time that are to be expected, frequency things, but nothing that you would call like a repetitive problem. That's just the difference between a mix room, which is a compromised space, and a mastering space, and a mix engineer who's focused on a single, and a mastering engineer who's focused on a single in context of a whole. I'm trying to think what else. What else have I seen lately that was kind of a trendy issue? Well, I mean, the main things are like conceptual issues. And I will call these mistakes because they're not something that people are doing with the work, but it's an idea that people have. So the last 5 years, this notion of -14 for Spotify, or really any version of looking at metering. Metering is absolutely irrelevant for a mixer. You could go your whole life mixing and never look at a meter. It's just, it's just not important. Sure, if you're clipping over 0, maybe that's a bad idea. But in modern workflow, sometimes you wouldn't even hear that. So the notion of putting some sort of a mathematical numbers or some sort of visual clue ahead of listening and feeling the music, that's a tricky one in this era. Everybody's looking for security and comfort in some sort of external validation, like, oh, the numbers say I'm good, or oh, the meters say I'm good, or this graph or whatever. None of that means anything. So as a mixer, you could make a -10 integrated average mix that sounds really bright and is horrific. You could make one that sounds really dark and low-endy that's decent. You could make one that's very balanced that sounds amazing. The numbers really don't tell anything. So engineers tend to be, there's a nerdy side to all of us. I certainly have that. But we have to keep it in check. We have to listen. We have to feel it. We have to be, the only kind of objectivist thing is translation, which is really a mastering thing. So even that, it's more important that mixers make musical choices that only translate in their room than thinking about translating everywhere, or thinking about balancing the tracks to each other, or thinking about levels. Like, that's all mastering stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
people mentally get in their own way, you know, because really it's easier that way. It's easier to say there's a number, or there's a graph, or there's some visual thing. It's harder to trust yourself. It's harder to do the thing that great artists do, which is just rely on their internal compass. And so as a mixer, I encourage people to do that, because whatever they do is going to be fine if they do that. If they start putting thoughts ahead of what's musical, it gets in the way. You know, I've told this story before, but the 2000 and goodness, when was it? 2004. I did a record for Pete Crescent, British artist, and he self-mixing, didn't have a lot of mixing experience, you know, truly an artist, had some hi-fi speakers that were some two ways, God knows what they were. And what he sent me was, you know, something that wouldn't win any mix contests. You know, if you listen to it online, you'd be like, well, that sounds very, very, very dark and very fat on the bottom, and I don't really know what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And once I adjusted all those things and sort of brought out what was there, turns out the musical decisions were amazing. And it was a beautiful record, because he had made nothing but musical choices in his space with his monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
And very much no objectivist thinking, you know, very subjectivist thinking, but he had good taste and he was musical. And that's what wins the day, you know.
Mm-hmm.
The person that, you know, wins the mix contest, you know, I won't name names, but there are people who are very famous for mixing who could win a mix contest, but there's things missing in those mixes that I hear being done better in people who are doing technically worse mixes.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's that. There's the minus 14, minus 10, any kind of measurement and any kind of visual. You know, you got to feel it. It's got to have momentum. You got to have enough vocal, not too much. You've got to have the right kind of midside, low end balance for your style, the right kind of dynamics, limiting and compression for your style, and those are the things that really matter.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe your process step by step so we can understand what you're doing in mastering?
For a single or for a record?
For a single.
Okay. Well, first of all, I have probably 15,000 hours of experience as a musician. And then as a producer of analog tape music, and I play a bunch of instruments, and I made a bunch of records back in the day, in the 90s, doing analog tape. And then, you know, so I look at mastering as a enhancement step, an extension of the artist's vision. So the first thing is you got to have that kind of experience and that sort of mindset, not a fixing mindset, not a perfecting mindset. And then I built a space that the monitoring is amazing, and the D to A is amazing. The amplifiers are amazing. I've done countless hours of testing to elevate the playback so that it's very much close to what I hear in my head, but also translates without having to think about it, which is a key thing. So it's technically right, but it's also musically right for me, going back to the musicality idea of a mixer.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've developed a gear chain 20 years ago that I've added to some recently, but almost all my records are primarily through this analog chain. You know, the only plugin I've ever used starting in 2010 was a digital EQ. And so, you know, I've got serial number 1 of the alpha compressor. I've got a Fairman EQ with all custom tubes. Every one of the 22 tubes is an upgraded new old stock option. I've got a Focusrite EQ where we took out all the chips and upgraded them from 50 cent, 55, 34 chips to Burr Brown $20 chips. There's like 60 of those in there. We took out a bunch of caps. Mm-hmm. So I have a really nice solid state EQ, an amazing tube EQ. The Fairman, I think, is the best tube EQ ever made. And serial number 1 of the alpha compressor. And then in recent years, I've added an overstayer piece, which is like a pair of FET compressors, like as if 1176s were matched, but the transformer not as aggressive. It's a Jensen, so a little different sound than 1176s, but kind of similar. And I have that as an option. And then more recently, I added some SPL hardware from the 90s. That's interesting. And so, I basically listen to a track, listen to a record very quickly as I'm doing tips and tails. And if there's a bunch of them, I'm balancing out levels in the software. I'm just seeing what the style is and, what are the, frequency parameters, what are the dynamics parameters, what's the harmonic distortion. I just kind of clip through with the cursor and quickly analyze what's there and begin to, intuit and think about what it is they were trying to do. And my goal is to maximize what I believe they were trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that's very different from fixing or perfecting or analyzing critically. It's more like, how can I be a contributor to this process? And in order to do that, you have to have a lot of courage, because you have to be willing to step in certain cases, and then you also have to know when to step out. The main challenge that mastering engineers have, and the reason why there's so much subpar mastering out there, is that, you can get a software suite with EQs, compressors, limiters. Okay, that's really all the tools you need. But the trick is really when to be aggressive about going in and doing things and when to stay out. And sometimes it's right next to each other in the same track. Sometimes it's aggressive here, but definitely not there. And so that's really the art of it. So when I'm going through and listening, I just, let's say it's a record. I start with tips and tails, fades, levels. Then I'll go and do some digital EQing and just quickly, kind of look at it like it's a sculpture, so we're starting with a big block of wood, and we're going to start to kind of shave our way in. So the digital EQ first, then I go to the analog chain, and I make usually at this point one setting per record, if I can get away with that, which I usually can. Up until 2010, it was one setting per song. But again, having a digital EQ where I can do section by section EQing really helped. And then I'll do one setting for the record that kind of encapsulates where everything kind of wants to go, in my opinion, needs to go. And then I'll do that, and then I'll go back to the digital EQ, and I'll do more with digital EQ. And if needed, I'll come back to the analog, and I'll change that overview setting. And it's kind of like, like you said, like sculpting. You're just coming in further and further, more and more details. I'm looking at the things I mentioned. I'm looking at musicality. I'm looking at frequency balancing, harmonic distortion, compression to transients. In a record setting, I'm not trying to homogenize the record. I don't want it to be all the same, but I want it to sound like it's all one record. So again, that's an art form. The craft goes to art at that point, because how much do you make it the same and how much do you leave it different? The more diversity, the more musically interesting. But if it's too diverse, it's going to not sound like the same record, or it's going to sound, technically, translation-wise, not so good. So there's a balancing act there between doing too much and too little on, my least favorite term is homogenization. You just don't want to homogenize it. You don't want to take out anything that's unique and interesting. So yeah, a balance between the digital EQ. I might do one per song. I might cut into sections. There may be level changes per section. Again, very subtle to help momentum. I'll look at midside and do usually a global midside setting if there's any tweaking to midside EQ. Looking at color in the analog world, and just kind of going back and forth. It's sort of like the analogy again of the sculpture. If it's a single or if it's a bunch of singles, it's like juggling. Each of these sculptures, let's say they're little wooden busts, little wooden head sculptures, right? So each one is getting tweaked, but they're also being juggled where they all are being elevated, right? So we don't want, 4 of them to be amazing and 6 of them to be not amazing. That's not good. We want to get them all as high as they can go, but also at the same strata so that they hold together as a single unit. And I work quickly. I cursor skip a lot. The mindset is to stay fresh with the music. When I'm done listening, someone's going to listen for 20 seconds. And so I need to stay in that mindset. In production, you get in the rabbit hole of just living in the song, and I very much don't want to live in the song. I very much want to hear the song the way the audience will hear the song first time. So that's another part of my mindset is a first time impression, but also a 20-year impression. I want this to be great in 20 years. I want it to be impactful now. So I'm balancing those two things. There's a lot of balancing. There's keeping the uniqueness of the songs, but making them go together. It's having them all be at a high level. It's, how much immediate impact, how much timeless impact. These are all things that I think about. And mostly I'm just thinking, where is this trying to go? What could this be? What was it they were hoping to do?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the, kind of the guiding light. And when I get to where I think, okay, this seems about right, then I'll send it out. And, sometimes it's perfect. And sometimes it's totally not what they wanted. And they're like, oh, we actually wanted a much more dynamic record. I'm, oh, okay. Well, I send things out at a level that I feel comfortable with. Hot enough, not too hot kind of thing. And sometimes less dynamic, or sometimes it's like, oh, we really, wanted a much brighter, poppier thing. Oh, okay, no problem. So I'll get notes on the whole record, or I'll get notes on singles. But what I send isn't ever a disaster. So, that's the main thing is when you send something out, you want to inspire people's confidence. And so even if it's not what they wanted, it should be exciting to them. Again, with most mastering, you spend a little time thinking, what did they even do? Am I sure I like it better? I'm not, there's all sorts of things you don't want to have happen. You don't want to have them wondering if you did anything or why you did something or whatever. You want them to be getting out of their mindset. I'm literally looking to free people from the analytical prison of their mixing mindset and allow them to feel the music, for them to hear the music for the first time. What a concept. Right. So even though they've heard it 1,000 times, I want them to hear it for the first time. And then if they've had that experience, then they're excited. And then even if they have notes, well, that's fine. So now we're rolling the rock downhill, as opposed to trying to push the rock uphill, which is never good. So in all of music production, I encourage people to do things that help them roll the rock down the hill. Because it's more fun and joy being part of the process, even if it's a sad song or something you wouldn't think of as being fun. But when there's joy in the making of the process, then that comes across to people as listeners, which is a whole other topic, which is kind of the esoteric energy of music making, which is we literally put ourselves into the music. So I'm looking as the last person to touch the project to remedy and upgrade and bless the entire project so that what people hear isn't all the drama and trauma of making these songs, but what people hear is just the music. They don't know if it was recorded analog or digital. They don't know if it was a live vocal or 1,000 pieces comp. They don't think about these things. They just feel and enjoy the music. So that's the main thing that we're looking for.
Perfect. Do you change the order of your signal chain depending on the song, or it's always the same?
I don't change the order. For different projects, I might use some things and not other things, but most of the time I use almost the same chain. Really, for 20 years, it's almost the same chain. I've added a couple things, like I said, in the last 5 years. It used to be, up until maybe 5 years ago, everything was the same chain. My thing was I spent a lot of time finding the chain, and I did that in like 2004, 5. And once I kind of came to this silver bullet thing, then no matter what I ran through it, everything sounded better and it was easy to work. Kind of what you want out of analog, whether it be a preamp or a microphone or a mastering chain, you really want two things. You want it to just sound good innately without having to try, right? You want it to just be, oh, that's great. And then you want it to be easy to fuck with. You want it to be something that you can play with and adjust without it fighting you. This is the same for a microphone, same for a preamp, same for an analog compressor. Like you run through it and you're like, oh, that's cool. And then if you want to do more with it, that's also cool, right? That's kind of the beauty of analog. The difficulty with digital is there's a lot of like resistance at times with certain things. You have to be careful about certain things, or you don't necessarily get that. You don't necessarily get that bump that you get from analog, where there's like this quality enhancement that's exciting, So my chain was basically the same for a long, long time. And then I added that overstayer piece, and then recently I've added some of this SPL hardware from the 90s, which I found kind of interesting and unique. The thing about my chain is that once I print through it and it goes back to the workstation, I don't touch it. So if I was to touch it, it would destroy some of the harmonic
Mm-hmm.
beauty that is part of my system. So that's the thing. It's like I do it. If I have a revision, I redo it. I don't go back into the software and tweak it. If they're like, oh, we want it louder, okay, that's a retake all the way
Mm-hmm.
through. It's not like I'm going to put a limiter on it and push it. There's something very specifically beautiful about my chain that I will ruin if I was to mess with it
Mm-hmm.
after it's printed.
So I didn't get
So
the order of the signal chain is always the same?
it's I use an old MyTech converter because it's real punchy,
Mm-hmm.
and before that converter, sometimes I use an SPL machine head, which I added like a year ago. So I'll put that digitally on the mix before it comes out. Then optional, I don't often use it. I'd say maybe 20%. I use the overstayer, which is that FET compressor with the Jensen transformers. It's kind of a prettier pair of 1176s. That's optional. And then what's always happening, or almost always happening, is the Focusrite EQ, which has a solid state sort of forwardness. Then the alpha compressor, serial number 1, Elysia Alpha, which is kind of neutral. And then the Fairman EQ, which has a tube recess thing. So the solid state goes a little bit forward with those harmonics. The Fairman goes a little bit back. And you end up back where you were in terms of the plane of the image, but all the harmonics of both solid state and digital are in there.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, a few years ago, I went to, I've got a Better Maker analog limiter, the newer one. The old one he claimed was perfect, and I gave him all my notes, and then the new one, he did all my notes. And so then from there, it gets converted. I use the Pacific Microsonics converter, which is still the best A to D in shootouts. They were, discontinued because they couldn't get the parts. Everything today is all surface mount, which is convenient and smaller, but big physical discrete parts sound better. That's why we like, certain preamps, all the cool 500 preamps are using that kind of discrete circuitry. And so that converter uses discrete circuitry. And after the conversion, I until fairly recently, forever, I used the L2, but barely on, just like at 1.4 dB. And then after that, a Cranesong head for harmonics. And I swapped out the L2 with a couple more SPL pieces. I have the spatializer and the loudness maximizer. So those two are working in the digital domain, AES in now. And then the head is after those. So there's 3 digital pieces after conversion.
Great. I've seen a couple of interviews where you talk about the shape of the V. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'm talking about the low end. So the low end shape, in pop music, like if you pull up just about any pop music, what you hear is a very centered low end, right? So the stuff that's panned to the sides doesn't have a lot of low end to it. It's fairly thin. And that's what pop music is. Like subconsciously, a lot of music is just subconscious cues and trickery. So like the low end being centered without much low end or low mid range even on side material, that gives you this very deep, what I call V shape to the low end. And when someone hears that for 5 seconds, they know it's pop because that's the shape of pop. It's got kick and bass and vocal and nothing with any meat or girth of any sort panned to the side. And that helps with the low end. It helps to stay out of the way because, of course, when things are side panned and they have low end, they're interfering because, of course, everything in the middle occurs not in the middle, it occurs on both sides, right? So kick and bass are 50-50 here and here, but when you bring in other stuff that has low end and low mids, it's also here and here. So a deep shape like pop is contrasted with a sort of medium shape, which would be, kind of most of music, where you've got some low endy stuff and low mid stuff on the side, and it connects psychoacoustically with the kick and bass, again, because there's only two speakers. So the thing that's panned over to the side has the low end or the low mids, but below it is the kick and the bass. And so those things kind of hook up over here. And the kick and bass over here might hook up with a different thing that has its own low end. So that's kind of, the medium V is kind of the normal, quote unquote, most of music. And then you have this sort of very wide shape where you have really kind of messy low end, which I find a lot of beginners tend to do this. They don't do enough cutting of what's panned to the side. Here's a novice mistake: wide panning toms and having them have a ton of low end.
Oh.
So wide panning toms is kind of passe anyway. I mean, you can do it if you want. I'm not here to tell anyone how to mix. Maybe it'll be the greatest song ever, and you should do what your heart desires. But wide panning toms with a lot of low end is just a disaster. If we think of like pop music, most of music, and then we think of this shape, it'd be more like, I don't know what you'd call it today. There's not a lot of music that's shaped that way. It used to be what we call indie, like indie rock. I'm talking like 80s, 90s. I don't really, we're in more of a pop era, so we don't really have a lot of that music where the kick and the bass are just not really so groove driven. It's more like a band in a room kind of a vibe. It's more of a naturalism, like a more realistic thing. So you have more low end on the sides. And so that's a very different shape than this shape or this shape. And those three general shapes, obviously, these are just conceptual. We work in between all the time. But these three general shapes are very distinctly different to an audience. So if you have a song that should be kind of this, because it's like a rock band, let's say, with guitars, but you've got this coming out, this pop thing, that would lead someone to feel like it was maybe overproduced, expression that's not used a lot anymore, but used to be used a lot when some sort of a rock thing in maybe the 90s or maybe the 80s, but really came out in the 90s. When a rock thing was too pop, it was really about the shaping of the low end. There wasn't enough low end on the sides for it to feel more real and more authentic, So that shaping is just a 2-second, 5-second indicator of what we're in for stylistically. And so, on a record, I might play with midside shaping differently song to song to complement and contrast what each song is doing, because this song is maybe a bit more pop than this one. And, you can kind of see how that becomes its own little artistic tweak. None of these things are huge. They're just, it's mastering is 1,000 subtle choices that add up to a wow. I'm the guy that tests cables, and lately I was testing AES cables on digital, and I was surprised to find they sound different. I've got certain tubes in my equipment. I've got certain fuses in my amplifiers. I mean, it's pretty much any rabbit hole you can think of. I've been down the rabbit hole. Greg Wells very sweetly one day called me the rabbit. He was he introduced me to a Canadian client, and we were talking about Atmos, and then we started talking about something else. And he's like, Brian's just like, he's down every rabbit hole. Like, and he's like, actually, he's just the rabbit. And I was like, oh, that's very sweet. I'll take that. I said, can I repeat that you said that? He said, yeah, it's fine. So back to the shape of the V. That's just one of the things that is part of this cocktail of winning people over. What I'm here to do is make sure that the music that people make finds its widest audience and has the most impact on its core audience. And so that's shaping of low end and how midside works and how punch works and how the subconscious interpretation happens very much automatically with people with different elements of music, whether it be frequency balance, distortion, compression to transient, midside. Those are kind of the pillars, the mastering works in. If you were gonna formalize it and put it into, sort of, if I go into teacher mode here, because I do teach. I am teaching now first Monday of every month. The four pillars are pretty simple things. You know, you got EQing, which is frequency balance. You've got transient to compression balance, which is, you know, compressors and limiters. You've got harmonic distortion balance, which is, you know, adding, or you can't really take away, but sometimes you can add, and it seems like you took away. And then you've got the midside power balance. So those four things really, you know, in the most basic sense, plus how they work together, obviously, you know, that's kind of the foundations of the mastering tools. They're very simple tools. Using them in an advantageous way is a whole other thing. But on paper, it's pretty straightforward. You know, what do? Well, I EQ a little, I compress a little, I limit, you know, or compress a little, I do some harmonic stuff, and I play with midside.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's the engineering simplicity description.
So you were talking about emotions. How can you enhance the emotions of a song with the listener?
Well, I mean, the whole point of mastering is to bring out what's in the song. So, you know, when I'm listening for what is it about this that, to me as an audience member, is good. What is it that is moving? You know, the big thing in music is always the groove and vocal intelligibility. Without those two things, it's dead in the water. So anything I can do to enhance the way the music feels rhythmically, and to get the vocal to come across not as if let's see, I don't want to be shitty about other people, but there's a lot of mastering that is like trying hard to put the music in your face, right? Like, listen to my song. Here's the song, listen to it. It's like a billboard. You know, my mindset is very much not like that. My mindset is like what I jokingly call the hot girl at the bar technique. So, if you will, obviously this is a heteronormative example, but the hot girl at the bar does what exactly? When she's standing at the bar full of people, room full of people, what does the hot girl at the bar do? And the answer is nothing.
Nothing, yeah.
She doesn't have to do a damn thing because she's already done it. And what is the result of what she's done? She's magnetic. So what I look to do with music is enhance the magnetism of the music. So, you know, as opposed to, hey, listen to my song, bright and shiny and in your face, and it's like, I have no problem with things being loud, but they sure as hell better move air. And they sure as hell better have a feeling to them, which is, a lot of it is in frequencies. You know, frequencies correspond like to chakras. So like low end is groove, low mid is more where the heart is. You get higher end, you get into the vocal, you get into the top end, you get like that stuff. So, you know, you want to balance those frequencies for the style. And when you balance frequencies and midside shape and level and harmonic distortion, all these things we're talking about, when you start to balance these appropriately for what this song is about or what this style is about, then the connection happens because it's in the music. You know, my job is to enhance what's already been done. And so it's all these things we're talking about so that the music becomes magnetic to people. Now, it could be loud, but there's a difference between loud and loud that's trying too hard. So nothing I do is trying too hard. I believe that there's a lot of concepts behind what I'm thinking when I work, but I believe that what makes people like music is that the artist, in a sense, doesn't give a fuck if you like it or not. Now, that's a strange concept because, of course, everyone wants to be popular. Everyone wants to be liked. Every artist wants to connect. Connection is the name of the game in music. But there's an element of artistry where we want the artist to not be who we are, which is normal people with insecurities and worries. We want them to be above us. We want them to be something greater. We want the music to elevate us, you know. So if I listen to like Bruno Mars, or I listen to Katy Perry, or I listen to Nina Simone, or I listen to Joni Mitchell, you know, I want these people to have something I don't have. And so from a mastering standpoint, a part of that for me is not having the music come across as being desperate, not have the music come across as trying to get your attention. right? Like the world is full of billboards. You know, the internet on our phones every day is a billboard. Before that, it was TV. And what we're looking for from music is something that we choose to get closer to. So when the music is trying so hard to get your attention, it takes away the opportunity for us to choose to come closer to it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's always been a big part of my philosophy, is to make the artist seem confident, even if they're not, is to
Mm-hmm.
take their insecurities out of it and to elevate their stature, to raise them up so that they come across like, oh, wow, this is it could be brand new. You could have never heard them, but you hear it. You're like, wow, this person is great. Like, they're not great because of frequencies. They're not great because of volume. They're not great because of LUFS. They're not great because of compression. They're great because of this combination of all this stuff. And so my job is to enhance all those things so that when you hear it, you're like, wow, this is, we've heard so much music. We know what demos sound like. We know what mixes sound like, and we know what great records sound like. And when we hear a great record, even if it's a style that may not be our favorite, it's an undeniable experience. You're like, well, that's a great fucking record. I didn't necessarily know that I liked, Beyonce doing country or whatever, I mean, I didn't
Mm-hmm.
do that record, but I'm saying it could be something that's a surprise. I did the Marilyn Manson record, Pale
Mm-hmm.
Emperor, and it's a mid-tempo record, which is unusual for Manson, and it's real groovy, and it's got a lot of space in it. It's got a lot of breath in it. It's not sort of so much wall of sound stuff. And people would come over, and I'd be playing a song I'd be working on. Someone might stop by, and I'd play it, and they'd be like, "Wow, is that Manson? That's amazing. I didn't know I liked Manson." Well, now you
Mm-hmm.
do, right? So people are looking to like music, right? They're looking to come closer to it, and big part of my job is to allow that magnetism so that they want to come closer to it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the hot girl at the bar, she doesn't have to try. Music shouldn't, in my view, try to get attention. It should have already done the work so that when it's heard, it's magnetic.
Do you usually use different settings for the different parts of the song?
It depends. I'll do whatever's needed. I do more than most people sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes I do, very little. It's just like chain color and a couple tweaks. I've never met the song that couldn't be enhanced. Let me say that, like back in the 90s, I used to hear this thing, oh, the great mixes, you barely touch them and da-da-da. That's total bullshit. Let me just take a moment to clarify a giant misconception. The best mixes in the world, in my opinion, are the hardest ones to work on and take the most time because they're already so good that it's very easy to fuck them up. And it's very difficult to improve them.
Mm-hmm.
But they can be improved. I've never met the mix that couldn't be improved. But if it's really, 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 really good, it's trickier business. You've got to really know what you're doing. And so you've got to be real careful with that. By the same token, if something is done in a very, I don't love this language, but let's say sort of amateurish way, like a not very good mix, which again, I don't love that language, but you know what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
A mix that sounds like a demo. Let's put it that way. A final mix that kind of sounds like a demo, kind of feels like it's unfinished, right? Those are actually very easy to work on. So I can take something that's at like 40% of potential and it can go to 80. I can do that 10-song record in an hour. That's an easy job. If something comes in at 95%, I can get it to 98, but that's going to take more time because it's already great.
Yeah.
It's already great. And so anyway, that wasn't exactly your question, but that was my answer. What was your question that you actually asked me?
No, my question, actually, I forgot it too. So.
Oh, all right, moving on.
Yeah, moving on. Yeah, that's fine. Because I was thinking about this perfect mixes like people wants to achieve. I was thinking about mixes now. They have, for me at least, they have too much quantization and a lot of autotune, etc., etc. So my question here is, how can you add humanity to a song during mastering? I mean, is it possible?
Well, a couple of things in there. First of all, I mean, I do my best to never judge what I'm working on. Like if I find myself thinking this sucks, I walk away
Yeah.
because it's not my job to judge.
Mm-hmm.
If someone sends me something, they obviously love it. They've done their best. It's my job to enhance. So the first thing is I don't judge the work. I don't say too much auto-tune or to what.
Mm-hmm.
I don't say too much compression or limiting or whatever. I just look to make it better. So that's the first thing. The second thing, perfect mixes. You said people are trying to make perfect mixes. That doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
There is no perfect mix. There's no perfection in music, and don't try to do it because you're going the wrong way. What music is a language of humanity. You know, the arts are the humanities. It's about humans. It's about human connection. You know, is there a perfect painting? You know, is Van Gogh perfect? Is Picasso perfect? No, no. Is the Mona Lisa perfect? No. They're just
Mm-hmm.
paintings, and they connect. They connect. So music is never about perfection. And, you know, we're computerized. We're in the box. We got damn near free recording with plugins. It's easy to get into this kind of perfectionism thinking, but that's not the way to go. The way to go is to think about connection. So connection, back to how can I enhance the humanity, connection is very much in those four pillars I was talking about. It's how the frequencies come across. It's how the harmonics come across. It's how the midside comes across. It's how the transient and the limiting come across. It's how the thing feels. You know, does it feel human or does it feel like it was done by AI? The place that we're at in music today is that it's fairly easy to make something average to above average slightly. It's pretty easy for anyone to be somewhere between average and above average. It's pretty hard to be below average. Like, you have to try hard. But because it's pretty easy to be somewhere between average and slightly above average, that's the new standard of not very interesting. So in a world of 1 million songs a day being put on the internet, you really have to, as an artist and as an engineer, you have to go for being great. And to go for being great, you have to let go of things like perfect. You have to let go of anything except the human things. So the artist, for example, the artist has to dig deep. They have to be vulnerable. They have to be creative. They have to be risky. They have to be bold. They have to be authentic to themselves. If you're not authentic as an artist, people can hear it. You know, they're not going to care. So it has to start with the artist and the songwriting. You know, vulnerability, authenticity has to be there. And then as engineers, we can't go around thinking about perfect. We can't go around thinking about control. We have plenty of control. Control's not the issue. What we need to go around doing is thinking about making something connect, having it be magnetic. You know, the hot girl at the bar, she's magnetic.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, back to me, it's you know, a lot of it is frequency. You know, there's very subtle things about low mid-range that will change something from being ignorable to being more emotionally connecting, because that low mid-range is connected to the heart. There's things that will happen in the low end with the groove that will go from being, you know, I can't change the groove, of course, right? The drummer's the drummer, the drum loop's the drum loop. But I can shape the way that groove comes across to enhance that groove. So, you know, this all ultimately is not something that you can exactly talk about, you know, just conceptually, but the conceptual part is the intention. You have to have the intention before you can learn the skill. So the intention has to be humanism. The intention has to be connection. The intention from the artist has to be authenticity. The intention in the engineering has to be, like I say, connection, humanism. So when you have those intentions, then you chip away at it. We're back to the wood sculpture of the bust. You chip away at the face until you get it to come across. You know, and it can be little here, little there, little here, little there, and it starts to come across.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you have to let go of judging these works, and you have to say, if this was me, if I made this record, if I had my whole heart in it, if I spent tons of hours on it, what could I do at this stage to make this thing go up a notch or up 3 notches?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what could I do? You have to bring that to it. So it's not a judging, it's not a perfecting. That doesn't exist. It's about humanizing it and making it connect. And that concept is the most important thing. Without that concept, what you do after isn't going to be as good.
You were talking about overcompressed mixes. How do you deal with that?
Well, usually when something's overcompressed, it builds up in the low end. So you've got to do some aggressive aggressive cutting of the low end.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe after aggressively cutting all that, then you might compress it even more. Or you might put a limiter on it with some sort of fast attack, you know. Sometimes the remedy to a problem is more of the same problem.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you never know. But it's some combination thereof. You know, sometimes with overcompressing, if you cut out some low end stuff where the energy is building up, you know, you're trying to find movement in the groove. You're trying to find movement in that block of energy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if something is like synth pad background and then it's overcompressed, now it gets really tricky because the synth pad is taking up all the space.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those are the hardest ones. But if something doesn't have a, you know, just droning synth note behind it, if it's over compressed, you can usually EQ out of it, and then you can EQ in some higher end things where the energy will be spiking and jumping. You know, you can get some snare movement, you can get some kick beater movement, you can cut some, you know, energy just sitting there doing nothing. You know, again, the mindset has to be: we want the drivers to move, we want the air to move,
Mm-hmm.
we want we want the groove to be palpable and physical coming out of speakers. And this is where monitoring comes in. You know, my monitoring has always been very dynamic. I discovered the barefoot line. I had the second barefoots ever made before Thomas and Teddy got together. I introduced Teddy to Thomas back in 20 years ago, you know. And the reason that I stopped using the original barefoot MM12, which was a front firing 12, 2 5s and tweeter, and on the back the amp was a Bryston 4B SST strapped to the back, split half to the sub and half to the mid and the high, which is a fantastic amp. But, you know, the reason I stopped using those around 2008 or 9, whenever it was, I used that for 4 years. Again, this is before barefoot was a thing. Was it wasn't dynamic enough. And so, you know, I've always moved towards dynamic drivers. You know, dynamic drivers are really important. That dynamic driver will really help you to EQ, to compress, to use harmonic distortion, etc. Yeah, I'll put it out there. Product plug alert. So the guy that makes my speakers, I've been making a 2-way with him, and we're maybe 6 months from having that on the market. And there's a lot of key ingredients that I had to have in this thing. One was cohesion, where you wouldn't hear the difference between the woofer and the tweeter. One was low level dynamics. So even at low level, when you have cohesion, frequency cohesion, and you're not listening to, you know, 2 and 3 drivers in a box separately, but you've got this whole image cohesion, and you've got even low level dynamics. And this driver is amazing. It can do 112 dB with 500 watts a side, so it can do loud, but it can also do really nice, you know, 65 dBA low level dynamics. So having dynamic drivers is really helpful with overcompression because you've got to be able to hear it. You know, and frankly, if people had more dynamic drivers in the first place, they might not overcompress because compression can be kind of a crutch where you're like, oh, that's cool, that's cool, that's cool. And it's like, if you could really hear how fucked up it is because your drivers just kind of stop moving, that would be helpful. But, you know, the world we're in now, there's people mixing on $500, you know, junk, and then there's the world of monitors, which has become very expensive for the good ones, and so it's a tricky position. But yeah, shameless plug. In 6 months or so, there'll be an option. There'll be an option for that.
Mm-hmm. Do you always listen at the same volume, or are you changing during the day or during the song?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I listen mostly at the same volume, and then I'll switch, you know, because I know the monitoring, and you know, there's the whole, you know, Fletcher-Munson curve, right? The 85, 86 dBA kind of thing. So I have a Radio Shack meter on my desk, and I listen to 85 to 90, but I don't listen for a long time. Again, I cursor skip.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just like, you know, beep, 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 maybe 1 second, maybe 5 seconds, maybe 10 seconds. But I'm not just sitting there blasting 90 dBA. You know, I'm trying to listen as little as possible, but as much as is necessary to get to the end of the road. And then I also use, in recent years, I've switched to using headphones. When in the last 4 years, when Atmos became a thing, and I started to work in Atmos, I've got Al Schmidt, who's obviously no longer with us. I've got his former headphone amp, which is a DCS Bartok. I bought that from his estate, and I've got 3 sets of headphones that are they kind of run the range of a brighter set, which is a Sennheiser HD800s with a Y-Wires cable that helps a lot, and then I've got a fatter sort of low-end dominant set, which is the MX4 Odyssey, again with the Y-Wires cable, and then I have these, which are not really well known in our world, but this is the Abyss 1276, and the Abyss is it's handmade in New York State. He was around before Odyssey, and it's planar. And those are just they sound very much like my speakers. They're very full range, down to 7 hertz and very linear. And so I have those 3 headphones, the bright emphasis, the low end emphasis, the middle, and I'll check on those as well. And then I also, in the last couple of years, I have this is off the market. This is a real interesting thing. I help this company. This is a company called XMEMS. They're a Silicon Valley company. I don't know if you can see it, but it's these little teeny little earbuds. You just stick one in each side, and they have a single driver in each one. The driver is it's a silicon microspeaker. So silicon, like chips, phone chips, computer chip silicon, made in the same kind of factories. And it's 4 millimeters square. It swings like a barn door, and it's really fast and stops really quickly. And the EQing on it is kind of way off. So I EQ it. They're technical people. They're looking to sell those. They are selling them to like Apple and everybody who makes in-ears. But I've been helping them to tune them, and so I tune mine with a dangerous back EQ. So that's a whole other level of neutrality because the distortion is amazingly low. The thing about those that's interesting is the phase accuracy. Like even on these speakers, which are very very fancy, phase shift is just a thing we accept with speakers. The phase on those is plus or minus less than 1 degree of phase shift from 20 hertz to 10K, which is just, it's never been heard before. If you hear it, it's like listening to the file. That's how I describe it. So I do those speakers generally at one level, quickly skip around. I do the headphones, check the low mids, low end, check the high end, the neutral headphones sometimes, and then the super neutral silicon micro speakers. When printing, I will dim the mains and just either let the mains run, or I'll just listen. I'll listen with the headphones running, but not on my head. Like I'll just, make sure there's no dropouts or anything like that when I'm printing.
Do you think you could master only using headphones?
I wouldn't want to do that. No, I mean I could do it, but of course I could do it. I mean, the Bartok is an amazing headphone amp, and these headphones are amazing. I mean, I could do it, certainly, but I wouldn't want to do it, and here's why. And this is why mixing with headphones and in-ears is also not the best idea. This is maybe a thought you haven't heard before, but in my experience, listening to mixers, and I get 2,500 songs maybe a year, so I hear a whole range of people's work. And there are some famous people who do stuff on headphones, and I can hear it. Let's go with the things that are good. The things you can do with headphones or in-ears is you can place things and EQ things kind of everywhere they need to go. Okay, well, that's a big deal. That's great. That's fantastic. But what you can't do is you can't hear the midside power balance because you have no phantom center. So a headphone or an in-ear does not do phantom center. What it sounds like is that the speakers were, left, right, and then they went here. It went from out here to here. It's not this, phantom center thing. So that phantom center thing is really essential because it helps with these things that we've talked about. It helps with midside. It helps with the humanity of how the voice and the groove and the lead instrument, which is all usually panned down the middle, how that connects. the the thing about mixes that I hear that are done, and they're very well done. Like these are mixes that could win an award for a mixing contest, right? But to me, they're still a B plus or an A minus. It's not an A plus because there's a little bit of a forward shape. There's a little bit of a sense of music centered and then supporting that needs to happen. And there tends to be just wall of sound. The headphone will just give you a really nice, contained, accurate, quote unquote, well done, but still a wall of sound. It won't quite have that forward push because it's without having the phantom center in a room. It's really hard to do that. So I would choose not to do that.
Do you use references in any way?
Yeah, I mean, not like I used to, but I have 12 ref files from the mid 90s when I started, and I used them for a long time. So every day I would start my day by listening to the refs. A big part of music production and particularly mastering is you've got to know where you are. You're the most important piece of gear, and you've got to know where you are. So, are your ears tired? Did you have a drink? Did you eat a bunch of sugar? Like, should you just have a coffee? All these things affect frequency balance and all that stuff. Are you anxious? Are you tired? Whatever. So the refs would be helpful for me to just kind of pop through them quickly and reset myself at the start of the day. So I recommend that people do that. At this point, no, I don't ever start the day that way. I will come back to refs if I send out a pass and they like it, but they actually want it different, and I do maybe a second pass. If that doesn't work, then I'll be like, hey, just send me some refs. And they'll send the refs, and then I have to be clear that there's two kinds of refs, right? There's production refs, which are targets, like I like that snare drum, I like that vocal, I like that bass. And then there's mastering refs, which are about the things we've discussed. They're about level, harmonic distortion, frequency balance, transient to compression balance, midside power balance. So hopefully I get back some mastering refs, and then I'm like, oh, okay, I see what you want, no problem, But I don't ask people for that up front, and I don't, rely on it in some way. I mean, I'm pretty confident that I can do a good job out of the gate. But yeah, I mean, I used to have a palette of options. The refs that I recommend people make if you're an aspiring mastering person is refs that describe the edges of acceptability. So again, not production refs. Productions are targets. That vocal, that bass, that snare drum, that synth, whatever. I want refs that are the edges, not the target. So the edges are like, okay, really forward vocal, but okay. Buried vocal, but okay. Really dynamic, but cool. Really compressed, but still cool. Really bright, a little bit sibilant in the vocal, but still works. Really dark, fat, but still works. Things that are opposites of each other, that are kind of the fence, they're the edges of acceptability, so that when you're doing your thing, you can work inside the fence, and you'll know that you're in the realm of acceptability. I mean, at this point in my life, the fence is it's more of a ball. It's like, I think of it as the recorded history of music. It's like a sphere, and I bring things into that sphere based on, what it is and where I think it should go, blah, blah, blah. But for starters, yeah, some refs that describe the edges in the beginning are very helpful.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Are you still mastering at 44.1?
I am. I have always done 44.1, and I will do it as long as I can. Yeah, there's a couple reasons. One is surprisingly, it's still the most popular format that I get, but there has been for some time, sample rate conversion that's perfect. So I use a dB power amp, which is like $35, and the thing about the lower sample rates, if you have a great converter, it doesn't matter. The whole sample rate discussion it has a few tiers. One tier is if you have a lot of plugins running, it's probably helpful. But again, like the best mixes I've ever heard from the best mixers in the world are very often at 44.1. It just doesn't matter. This is one of those nerdy tech things that people get caught up on that just doesn't matter, right? So if you've got a great converter, like my converter was 24 grand when it was new, and they discontinued them around 2002, and that's a 2-channel A to D, D to A, Pacific Microsonics. If those were made today, the guy that used to own the company is a friend. He's like, we can't make them because we can't get the parts, which is why they stopped making them. It wasn't that people didn't want them, but he said they'd be 70 grand, And so when you have converters that are really high quality, it doesn't have to be mine, but it could be any really high quality converter. The sample rate, it really doesn't matter. It's just a slight flavor change. And I like the flavor on the 44.1 side. It's a bit more density to it. Like the extreme version of that would be like a 16-bit DAT tape. And DAT tape is all kind of overly dense, but a lot of great records were done on DAT tape. So the format doesn't matter. If it helps your converter, if you think it sounds better at 88.2 or 96, you should go for it. If you think it's better for your plug-in chain or what have you, you should go for it. But the more that time goes on, I hope people realize that none of that stuff matters. It's just something we get caught up on, again, because the nerdy side of us wants to take security in something that's objectively measurable. And it turns out music is harder than that. Now, cheap converter, like my converter at 44.1, and let's say I go to a Guitar Center and over in Pasadena and I grab a, $200, Focusrite, I probably would run that at a higher rate because it probably does sound better. Because when you have a cheaper converter, you will often get a better experience at a higher rate. But that's not the case with great converters. With great converters, it's all great. It doesn't matter.
Brian, I really appreciate you being here. It was a lot of fun talking to you. So thank you.
Well, my pleasure. I hope that people are inspired and maybe even learn something. And it's great to meet you.